Should journalists do everything they can to help police catch terrorists? Or are there some lines that shouldn't be crossed? The Investigators starts now.
The RCMP and Vice News were in court over a case that's testing the limits of press freedom in Canada.
It was never even an option to hand this over because it seriously will affect the way journalists are able to keep powers that be in check.
I'm delighted to sign this bill. It's been a long time since a bill like this has been signed.
Yeah, because I'm the president, see? Everything's my fault now.
What's going on in Washington is so intense, it's always crazy, nothing ever changes, and it's always over the top.
I'm Diana Swain. We're the Investigators. This is what we do. A journalist communicates with a Canadian ISIS fighter abroad and reports on their conversation. The police then want those texts, but the reporter says no. And now they're locked in a legal battle that seems headed for the Supreme Court of Canada. Ben Makuch works for Vice Media. He reported on the text he received from Farah Sheridan, a Canadian fighting for ISIS in Iraq and threatening the West with menacing messages like this one.
Inshallah, we'll make some attacks in New York soon, bidin Allah ta'ala. A lot of brothers, they're mobilizing right now.
The RCMP wants the texts Makuch exchanged with Sheridan. But Makuch argues he's already reported on what's in them, and handing them over effectively makes him an agent for the police. For journalists, that's the slippery slope that could forever erode the trust they could build with any source. This week, the Ontario Superior Court ruled Makuch has to hand over the texts because they could be used as evidence if Sheridan ever comes to trial. Vice is vowing to keep fighting in court, but can it win this battle in the court of public opinion? Ben, let's start there, because there'll be many people who are outside the world of journalism who'd be listening to this and going, why wouldn't you do anything asked of you to try to help catch a terrorist?
Well, first off, I will never speak to another source like this again if I were to start giving up this information freely. And I think that that's fundamental to how journalists operate. We have trust with our sources that we won't give up our information to the police. And, you know, it's not just terrorists, it's whistleblowers, it's people who provide information to journalists that allows the public to have a better understanding of what current events actually affect them and how they want their government to behave as a response to it. So it would effectively rot that relationship, especially in Canada. And I think that my case specifically speaks to that.
This has been unfolding legally for a little while now, and I know at points you've said, look, and I've already reported on what was in those communications. There's nothing more there. You know, the police are saying, well, if there's nothing more there, then hand it over. So where do you sit on that?
To me, it was never even an option to hand this over, because what this is saying essentially is that whenever a journalist talks to anybody, and a law enforcement agency or a spy agency, when they need the information from you, they're just going to come and get it. So that effectively turns journalists into arms of the police state. And I think that is anti-Western democracy. I think that seriously will affect the way journalists are able to keep powers that be in check.
We know that this happens, for instance, if there's a riot, you know, after a hockey game is lost or something like that. The media's out there with cameras. They see people turning over cars. The police want to come get the video. And we've always said, you know, get a warrant and you can get the video. Is terrorism separate? Should we be viewing this as a separate thing because of the very seriousness of what it is at its nature?
I don't think we should be looking at it differently. I think I read a column recently that said that, you know, 9/11 changed the way that journalists should behave in a liberal democracy. And I think that that's actually counterintuitive, because we can get information about terrorists, about what are ostensibly enemies to our state that we are living within, and getting information about them that better understands motivations and why we need to combat it. And I believe the reporting I was doing and others was actually giving an insight into why and how people were being, quote unquote, radicalized into going over to these groups.
Ben, thanks so much. I know you're traveling and doing some journalism right now, so we appreciate you taking time out to talk to us.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
We're also digging further into a CBC News investigation this week about diversity on Canadian campuses. We asked nearly 80 universities across the country to provide a racial breakdown of their school's student population, and more than 60 schools told us they don't know. So why is that a problem?
Canada becomes more diverse, I think just eyeballing it isn't going to cut it anymore. We're actually going to need to start measuring who we're trying to serve.
Ontario's Chief Human Rights Commissioner says schools should collect race-based data because that can help identify groups that are struggling or help make sure the faculty reflects the students they're teaching.
There's no black faculty in my department whatsoever.
Something that I'm confronted with on a regular basis.
Like, as a young black man, I feel the average, I guess what you would call average type of racism.
So why have so many Canadian universities been reluctant to ask students about their race? Well, some schools told us they worry it could be seen as discriminatory or even illegal, which it's not.
Personally, I wouldn't mind sharing my background and my identity. I'm quite comfortable with it, proud of it.
There's been a lot of reaction since we aired the story, which I've been working on with CBC News producer Jeremy McDonald. So here we are. We've been working on this story, really you have now, for months. And we learned in the course of this that Ryerson and U of T are going to start at some point collecting this race-based data. But my first question for you in this story was, why do they need this?
Well, I mean, from what we hear from students, they feel like if their schools actually understand the racial makeup of their student population, they can target services more directly to them. We spoke to a student who basically said, it's reflected in her experience as a student with her professors, understanding that, you know, if we have a certain amount of a certain kind of student in our population, then maybe that should be reflected in how we hire, in terms of targeting support and even mention some financial support to help bolster events and groups that might cater to particular groups within that student population is also helpful.
So when you first came to me with this idea, and this was your idea to do this story, that was my first question, is why would this be useful for the students or the schools to know this? And then my next was, isn't this regressive, or are schools allowed to ask? And it's interesting because since we've done the story, that's some of the feedback we've gotten from people, frankly, closer to my generation than yours, saying, doesn't this take us backwards? What's the argument for saying no, it doesn't?
Well, I think the argument is, and I think Chief Commissioner Mandani got to this, this generation of students or younger people feel a little bit different about this information. They want to know, or they want schools to know who they are, and they want schools to understand maybe their specific needs. So some of the reaction that I've gotten from people who are maybe a bit younger is, this is great, this is fantastic. We've actually been trying to get at this information ourselves in some cases. So I think that overall there's this sense that, okay, we need this idea out there. We need schools to know that this is something that we want, because we want schools to understand who we are so they can better serve us.
And Ms. Mandani was saying, look, kids are so open on social media now. Like, they're talking about cultural background, their personal history in a way that people before seemed more private about. Now, the other thing is, when we were writing our scripts, you and I worked together on this, and you were using the word racialized, and I was like, I had not heard that word until now. So let's explain what it means.
Well, yeah, it's one of those words that, obviously for the sake of this story, I wanted to make sure that I understood it properly as well. It's a word that I had heard before. I mean, for me, racialized is kind of this idea that as a society, in order to distinguish between groups, we kind of project certain ideas and traits onto these groups. And I guess the eyes part of it is, when you're part of that group, you're on the receiving end of this, and often you don't have control over any of it, right?
So racialized sort of combines anyone from any visible minority group.
Yes, well, generally. Visible minority or person of color. Often, as is often the case, Indigenous people are kind of separated out of that category and kind of tracked and thought of as their own group. But generally speaking, we're talking about people who identify as being part of a visible minority or identify as being a person of color. I
mean, one of the best things for me about a journalist is that every time we do a story, I learn something too, which I did through this. So thanks for talking about it.
Thanks for having me.
It was, wiretapping.
Air quotes were fodder for comedians this week.
What is wiretap if not a cool slang term that means a bunch of different things?
Everyone, it seems, is talking about wiretapping. Why that's a problem. My POV ahead. Plus,
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
A made-for-TV president, but not who you think.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to begin today There are literally no words.
What does the journalist behind Veep, the award-winning comedy that satirizes U.S. politics, make of politics and the news media right now?
And it's very hard to do explicit satire of Trump.
My conversation with Frank Rich is next. But first,
Elmo had 3 ducks. Quack.
Generations of kids have grown up with the little red monster, but his days counting ducks may be numbered.
Elmo, you're being laid off.
Just like that? Elmo's been working at Sesame Street for 32 years.
Sorry, Elmo. It's true. Kinda. As this online parody points out, the Trump administration is proposing cuts to public broadcasting as part of its budget plan.
But Elmo's rent just went up. What's going to happen to Elmo's insurance? Elmo has pre-existing conditions.
Although Sesame Street gets money from private donors and runs on HBO, PBS stations could be hard hit. Not the first time politicians have proposed clipping feathers.
I like PBS. I love Big Bird. I actually like you too. But I'm not gonna keep on spending money on things to borrow money from China to pay for it.
In 2012, fans mocked Mitt Romney's comments, but this time it may be personal.
I'm Donald Trump, and I have more trash than all of you, so yeah.
The program has skewered Donald Trump for years, portraying him as a ruthless developer who would flatten the neighborhood for a new tower, even mocking his reality show.
Scram! You're fired!
Me? You can't fire me!
I just did!
So Elmo better brush up on that resume.
Elmo will go bye-bye now.
One more thing. Leave the puppet.
Leave the puppet? What do you...
Here are 5 things we learned this week from investigative journalists. A CBC News investigation found examples of questionable or misleading content on the websites of some Manitoba chiropractors, including claims of treating serious illnesses. The province's regulatory body for chiropractors says it's reviewing the content. A sworn affidavit provided to the Globe and Mail alleged that an organizer for Conservative leadership candidate Kevin O'Leary offered to pay party membership dues for 6 people, which would be a breach of party rules. O'Leary's campaign has denied the allegation. New measures restricting electronic devices from being carried onto U.S. and UK-bound flights were prompted by intelligence that ISIS was working on smuggling explosives onto planes. That's according to reporting by ABC News. Reuters reported that U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has directed American diplomats to identify, quote, populations warranting increased scrutiny. The directive is reportedly a response to President Donald Trump's call for extreme vetting of foreigners entering the U.S. And the Associated Press reported that Trump's former campaign chair, Paul Manafort, was paid millions of dollars to advance Russia's interests. The White House says Trump was unaware that Manafort worked for a Russian billionaire years before he worked for the campaign. So lots of questions still dogging the Trump administration. Democrats, too, still asking themselves lots of questions, including how did it all go so wrong for them? But they're not the only ones doing some soul searching.
Those of us in the national media have walled ourselves off far too much from where people live.
For many U.S. journalists, that's been the takeaway from the presidential election, that they failed to recognize just how popular Donald Trump is with millions of Americans.
I think we missed the overarching story to a large extent.
Journalists generally seem to accept they failed to recognize just how upset voters are with life in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, instead focusing too much on the largely liberal enclaves of big cities on the coast, where most high-profile journalists themselves live.
There's a huge lack of ideological and cultural diversity in our newsrooms.
But is the self-flagellation deserved? Frank Rich is a veteran journalist who's written this week about the hand-wringing of it all for New York Magazine. You'll also know his work from television.
I want to let you know that I will destroy you in ways that are so creative, they will honor me for it at the Kennedy Center.
He's a co-executive producer of HBO's political comedy, Veep. Love that clip, Frank. We're going to get to Veep in just a minute, but I want to talk about the article you wrote this week. And I know it's focused on the hand-wringing by Democrats over the loss, but also journalists. And I wonder, is the takeaway to anyone who reads that article that you think journalists have already done enough apologizing, or perhaps too much?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. This self-flagellation has really gotten out of control. Look, everyone missed the Trump juggernaut, including, I might add, the Republican Party, whose establishment thought he could never win, and conservative members of the media, conservative columnists who all thought he could never get the nomination. The fact is also Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote by 3 million people and lost the Electoral College by fewer than 78,000 votes in 3 states in aggregate. So enough already is sort of my feeling. Democrats have a lot of problems. Liberal media, the media has a lot of problems. Look at all the data journalism that showed that Clinton was going to win in a landslide. But this sense that they didn't know what was going on in white working class America, I think, is wildly overstated. And now it's become a fetish where there's so much, so many human interest stories about the same people that soon, it's become a cottage industry, really.
Well, and that was where I wanted to go next, is that you see the media sort of moving en masse to middle America now to show that it is connected, and in an effort, I guess, trying not to tell stories that originate out of Los Angeles or New York, trying to show that they are connected. Are we now then missing what's actually taking place in Washington?
I don't think we're missing it because, first of all, what's going on in Washington is so intense, it's like standing under a fire hose. And I do feel the coverage of it is really good, particularly given an administration that is trying to shut the press out, that I can say lies with impunity. And I feel that the media, the news media, have been energized by the election result. And it's not a zero-sum game. They can cover rural America, whatever they want to cover, but I think they're actually doing a terrific job in beefing up D.C. coverage in this incredible time in the history of this country.
Well, that's one of the questions we've been asking people over these past many weeks. Do you think that the news media as a whole has gotten its mojo back?
Yeah, and by the way, I would say one thing in defense of the news media prior to the election. There was a lot of good investigative reporting about Donald Trump, Trump University. The Russian story started to break. So it wasn't as if the media was asleep. It's just the self-flagellation since the election has made it seem it's almost an excuse for the things that they really screwed up, which is like, for instance, polling and, the upshot column in the New York Times, which till practically the morning of Election Day showed that Clinton was going to win by, I don't know, odds of 85 or 90%. It's sort of a good way to say, oh, it's just that we didn't cover people in the Rust Belt. That was the only problem. That was not the big problem. And in fact, some things the media did quite well.
So let's talk about Veep, which is a terrific show. And you've got a sort of group of people behind me here who love it. But satire, if satire is the extreme expression of something in order to make a point, how do you manage satire at a time when virtually everything that we're seeing is so over the top? Is there room left for satire?
Well, yes, that's true. And it's very hard to do explicit satire of Trump, although some people have succeeded, particularly Saturday Night Live with Alec Baldwin has done a pretty brilliant job, I think, and it's sort of rejuvenated them. What helped us in Veep is that we never, ever reference real politicians. We've never referenced Trump or Obama or Clinton. We never reference anyone past Ronald Reagan. We never even identify the character of its political party because the thesis of the show, which I totally agree with having grown up in Washington, is essentially it's always crazy, nothing ever changes, and it's always over the top. How our new season, which is up in a few weeks, will be received, we have no idea. We were fortunate by sheer luck that last season we had a crazy election, that season that aired last spring, that probably could not have topped 2016 if we'd shown it this season. But that's done, and we actually our heroine, if that's what she is, Selena Meyer, is now a ex-president in private life in New York, And Washington still figures in Veep in this season without giving anything away, but we're hoping we capture a mood that's timeless, even under Trump, in our own craziness. We didn't change a line of the show, which was halfway being shot anyway as the election happened.
Well, we're looking forward to watching it, and thanks for taking time to talk to us today.
Great talking with you.
Call me naive, but isn't that unethical?
You're naive. Welcome to politics.
Moving from satire to real life, what the battle between the real White House and the FBI tells us about politics and journalism. My POV next. Got a story tip for the investigators? Share it anonymously at securedrop.cbc.ca. You can also contact us by email, investigators@cbc.ca, or just reach out to us on Twitter @Swain Diana. You're watching The Investigators on CBC News Network.
A protected layer around the world, which we call the ozone layer.
I have been known to use air quotes from time to time, but I cannot bear to see this air quote one more time.
And very clearly quote wiretapping, that it was, wiretapping.
First of all, wiretapping is not a vague word like nice or warm. It's actually pretty specific, kind of like FBI and no evidence. Still, I watched with fascination this week as the head of the FBI testified about whether what the President of the United States tweeted out was true. That scene should be satire, but it actually took place. But here's the really crazy part. The level of mistrust of Americans of just about everything now seems to have reached a point where half don't believe anything the president says, and the other half don't believe what the head of the FBI says. And it seems that no matter what proof or lack of it is finally concluded, no one is going to change their mind about what they believe. And for that, Americans will spend about $3 million this year. That's a rough estimate of what the investigation into the tweet is going to cost. And that is a lot of money that could be better spent on something else. For instance, keeping Elmo on the payroll. I'm Diana Swain. We are The Investigators.